In the early 1900s, a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes was essentially a death sentence, especially for children. The disease would quietly invade, unnoticed at first. A child would become tired, lose weight rapidly, grow increasingly thirsty, and then slip into a coma. No matter how rich or poor the family was, there was nothing anyone could do once the disease progressed. Insulin, the hormone responsible for regulating glucose, had not yet been discovered. And without it, the body simply could not process food properly. The only known treatment was horrifying: starvation. At that time, medical science had no way to control blood sugar. Doctors would place patients on what they called a starvation diet. This meant reducing caloric intake to dangerously low levels, just enough to keep someone alive for a while. Meals might consist of a few vegetables or a tiny bit of broth. These were not real cures, just delays. It was a dry academic paper about the pancreas, the organ known to be linked to diabetes. But tucked inside was a small detail that sparked an idea in his mind. He didn't care about academic reputation. He just wanted to try. What if the pancreas produced something, a secretion that controlled blood sugar? And what if you could isolate it? He was also given an assistant, Charles Best, a 21-year-old medical student with very little lab experience. Best wasn't the top pick. He was one of 2 students chosen by coin toss to work with Banting over the summer, and then attempt to extract the remaining substance. Hopefully, the mystery secretion that controlled glucose. Parents watched helplessly as their children withered away, their bodies eating themselves from the inside. Dogs died. They were just 2 underdogs in a forgotten corner of a university lab, surrounded by barking dogs, dirty glassware, and a growing sense that they were standing at the edge of something enormous. Equipment failed, and more importantly, they didn't have the chemical expertise to turn their crude extract into something that could safely be used in humans. The university gave them little support. Still, he granted Banting and better lab space and access to more resources. But it came with strings attached. McLeod began overseeing the project more closely. His tone changed. And once he saw how effective the extract was, so did his attitude. But one day, something changed. Leonard was dying of type 1 diabetes. His body was wasting away, and he was days from death. He weighed just 65 pounds. His father, desperate, agreed to the experimental treatment. In fact, he was a struggling young Canadian surgeon, recently returned from World War I, where he served in the Army Medical Corps. He was brilliant in some ways, stubborn in others, but above all, he was obsessed. The crude pancreatic juice that worked on dogs needed to be refined. Human patients could not afford even a small mistake. It was a slow, painful decline. Some children, already skeletal, would be placed in dark rooms to conserve energy. The boy who had been waiting to die was now smiling, walking, living. The insulin was too impure. Leonard suffered an allergic reaction, but Collip refined the formula further, and just 12 days later, Leonard received a second dose. Letters from families with diabetic children poured into the University of Toronto. He had witnessed the breakthrough and even injected Leonard Thompson himself. But the Nobel Committee didn't see it that way. McLeod, the senior scientist who had joined the project late in a bold move, he immediately split his share of the Nobel Prize money with Charles Best, declaring publicly that the prize should have been theirs. Watched much of it from the sidelines, was now being treated as co-architect of the discovery. Within months, pharmaceutical companies were lining up to mass-produce the extract. When injected into another dog that had diabetes, the results were immediate. The dog's blood sugar levels dropped dramatically. It wasn't a cure, but it was proof that they were onto something real. In academic halls, in awards, in biographies, his reputation rose. It was a common sight in diabetic wards, where hope had long since faded. There are records of children weighing as little as 30 pounds, alive, but barely. In hospitals, nurses began recognizing the diabetes face. Gaunt, sunken eyes, pale skin, limbs like sticks. But far from these rooms of despair, in the city of London, Ontario, a man named Dr. Frederick Banting was about to change everything. Banting wasn't a renowned expert or part of a prestigious medical institution. But the moment it started working, the moment it could save lives. That S, when the politics began. One night, unable to sleep, Banting sat reading a medical journal. It was a wild idea. Most experts thought it impossible. But Banting wasn't a traditional scientist. He approached the University of Toronto and was eventually granted lab space, not by acclaim, but almost by accident. But from the moment they began, Banting and Best worked like men possessed. They started testing their theory on dogs. The plan was to surgically tie off parts of the pancreas, wait for the organ to degenerate. Their early experiments were rough. They successfully isolated a substance from the pancreas of one of the dogs. They called the substance iletin, named after the islets of Langerhans, the tiny clusters of cells in the pancreas suspected to produce insulin. This was the first step toward one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history. But at that moment, Banting and Best weren't thinking about fame, or the Nobel Prize, or even what would come next. Little did they know, the fight to save lives had only just begun. The discovery of insulin was raw, messy, and brilliant. After early experiments showed promise, Frederick Banting and Charles Best knew they were close to something historic. But they needed help. Their lab was crude, their methods unrefined. So they brought their findings to Professor John MacLeod, a respected senior scientist at the University of Toronto. He was skeptical of Banting's amateurish lab work and unimpressed by his lack of academic credentials. The more insulin worked, the more MacLeod inserted himself. As the team moved toward human trials, James Collop, a professional biochemist, was brought in to help purify the compound. That winter, the team began preparing for their first human subject, Leonard Thompson, 14-year-old boy at Toronto General Hospital. On January 11, 1922, Leonard received the first injection. The results were underwhelming. This time it worked. His blood sugar dropped. His energy returned. He was eating again. Doctors and nurses were in tears. Leonard Thompson became the first person in human history to be saved by insulin. News spread like wildfire. Newspapers across North America began reporting the medical miracle. Banting, Best, Collop, and even MacLeod were suddenly global celebrities, or so it seemed. But when the 1923 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was announced, it was awarded only to Frederick Banting and John MacLeod, not to Charles Best, not to James Collip. Best was devastated. He had been with Banting from day one. He had helped run every experiment. Banting was furious. He refused to accept the honor without acknowledging Best. MacLeod, perhaps out of guilt or pressure, later shared his half with James Collop. But by then, the damage was done. In the official record, the Nobel Prize, the most prestigious recognition in science, listed Banting and MacLeod as the co-discoverers of insulin, forever. And in the years that followed, MacLeod's name appeared in textbooks. Meanwhile, Charles Best, the young medical student who had been there from the first day, whose hands held the syringes, who suffered through failures and sleepless nights alongside Banting, was quietly pushed to the side. Even worse, James Collip, whose biochemical skills turned the discovery into a usable drug, became an afterthought. The discovery of insulin had saved millions, but it had also exposed something darker. In the world of science and history, who gets remembered? Ice and tea always, who did the work. And sometimes the people who gave everything are the ones the spotlight forgets. Insulin didn't just save Leonard Thompson, it changed the course of medicine. What was once a death sentence for children became a manageable condition. Type 1 diabetes was no longer an immediate execution. It became a lifelong battle, yes, but one that could be fought. Thanks to insulin, millions of people around the world were given a second chance at life. Universities, media outlets, and even award institutions began to elevate the names that suited prestige and hierarchy. His instincts, his persistence, and his radical thinking were often overshadowed by the polish and credibility of John MacLeod, who many institutions elevated as the true mastermind. The young medical student, Charles Best, was often written out or relegated to a footnote. His role was described as assistance or support, despite his direct involvement from day one. But the story of insulin's discovery, the one told in textbooks and museums, has never been as clean or fair as the science itself. In the years after the discovery, the narrative was slowly reshaped, and Frederick Banting, though celebrated, was sometimes portrayed as lucky, almost stumbling into discovery by accident. It was the familiar story of academic politics, where power shapes memory, History rewards the established over the disruptive. And more importantly, he helped lay the foundations for Canada's national health system, a legacy that still benefits millions today. But over time, that version began to crack. Modern researchers and historians, looking back at notebooks, letters, and lab records, began to reevaluate the facts. And what they found was clear. Banting and Best were the real pioneers. They did the early experiments, they took the risks. It's easy to celebrate the face of a discovery. It's harder to look behind the curtain and see the sleepless nights. The hands in the lab, the people who didn't need applause to do the work. They believed in the idea when no one else would. It was James Collip, not MacLeod, who made the chemical breakthrough that turned insulin into a usable drug. He changed medicine. He helped turn a death sentence into a treatable condition. He never wrote bitter memoirs. In fact, he was so committed to the idea that insulin should be available to all that he famously sold the patent for just $1. He never sued anyone. He simply kept going. In many parts of the world, insulin is affordable and accessible. But in others, especially the United States, the story is very different. MacLeod, they argue, was a supervisor at best, an opportunist at worst, a man who saw history being made and stepped into the spotlight just in time. A type 1 diabetic can need multiple vials per month, pushing the monthly cost to over $1,000 without insurance. Parents crowdfunding insulin for their children, emergency rooms treating people in diabetic ketoacidosis, a life-threatening condition that occurs when insulin is missing. And yet, Charles Best never fought back publicly. They're part of a pattern, a crisis. In fact, Canadians often cross the border to help their American friends and family. The pharmaceutical industry in the US has enormous political power. And unlike Banting's humble $1 sale, today's insulin formulas are wrapped in layers of intellectual property protections and business strategy. In Europe, the situation is also better. Insulin is seen as a basic human right, not a luxury product. He never launched a media campaign. He continued working in medicine, became a respected scientist and professor. In a world obsessed with credit, Best chose quiet impact. Organizations like T1 International and movements like #InsulinForAll are demanding transparency, price caps, and legislation to make insulin accessible again. They're marching, protesting, even testifying before Congress. Some states have already passed insulin price cap laws. Others are considering it. Change is slow, but it's growing. It's out of a commitment to humanity. Banting nearly gave up his medical career chasing this breakthrough. Best worked tirelessly, sometimes unpaid. Collip labored to purify it for human use. Some skip injections, some dilute them, and tragically, some die. Even when the spotlight passed him by, he remained focused on the real goal: helping people. It's a pattern that echoes throughout history. The real workers, the ones in the trenches, often get forgotten while others write the headlines. Charles Best was one of those people. He saved lives, and he never asked for anything in return. So as we look back, nearly a century after that first injection, let us remember not just the miracle of insulin, but the quiet hero who helped make it possible. Not for glory, it's not for awards, just because it needed to be done. When Frederick Banting first discovered insulin, he didn't do it for the money. He believed that no one should profit from saving lives. His words were simple, almost prophetic. Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world. But 100 years later, that vision has been buried under corporate profit margins and broken healthcare systems. Today, insulin is a multi-billion-dollar industry, dominated by just 3 pharmaceutical giants: Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi. There, the price of insulin can be so high that millions of diabetics are forced to ration their doses. In the US, a single vial of insulin, something that costs less than $10 to produce, can be priced at over $300. Stories have emerged of young adults dying in their sleep because they couldn't afford enough insulin. These aren't isolated incidents. One that stands in direct opposition to everything Banting and Best believed in. Now contrast this with Canada, Banting's home country. Their insulin is affordable, so why the difference? The answer lies in patents, lobbying, and a lack of regulation. This isn't about innovation, it's about control. But the story doesn't end in despair. Across the US and the world, activists are fighting back. People are sharing their stories. And with every voice added, the memory of Banting's sacrifice gains strength. There's a painful irony at the heart of this tale. Insulin was born out of sacrifice. Yet today, that same drug is used to enrich companies at the expense of those it was meant to save. Would Banting or best recognize the world we live in now? Would they understand why children still die from a disease they cured a century ago? Or would they feel betrayed? Charles Best never made a fortune. He rarely made headlines. But his work lives on in every injection that saves a life. He could have spent his later years campaigning for recognition. He didn't. Instead, he quietly built a career in public health, helped expand Canada's health system, and stayed out of the spotlight. He didn't ask to be remembered, but we should remember him anyway. Because sometimes the real heroes aren't the ones with their names in history books. They're the ones who never stop doing the work. If this story moved you even a little, consider sharing it. Too many people still don't know where insulin came from, or what it has become. Let's change that. Drop a comment below. Do you think insulin should be free? Should medicine ever be a business? And if you want more powerful stories from medicine, science, and forgotten heroes, hit subscribe and join the journey. Because history isn't just about the past, it's about the future we choose to create.